Syrian rebel leaders say they are now in full control of the strategic city of Homs after government forces withdrew. The city's capture leaves the road to Damascus open for the main rebel offensive from the north, while opposition factions in the south are already on the capital's doorstep. These images on social media show Syrian protesters toppling a statue of the president's late father in the southern suburbs of Damascus. Syrian state media report that President Bashar al-Assad is still in the capital, although he hasn't been seen in days. Government soldiers have been seen fleeing across the border into Iraq. Now, in cities recently captured by the rebels, residents are already celebrating the end of Assad's decades-long rule.
There's a celebratory mood here in Hama. It was only 2 days ago that Islamist-led rebels captured the city from Syrian government forces. Residents are keen to reclaim their city from the grasp of President Bashar al-Assad. The lightning pace at which rebels are marching across the country has taken many by surprise. In less than 2 weeks, opposition forces have taken control of vast swathes of the country, including major cities like Aleppo and Hama. There have been reports of mass defections from the Syrian army across the country, including in Damascus. The shifting front lines of this civil war are also bringing wider geopolitical divides into focus. Russia, one of Syria's closest allies, denounced the rebel advances.
We are very much sorry for the Syrian people who became a subject of another geopolitical experiment. We are absolutely convinced of inadmissibility to use terrorists like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham to achieve geopolitical purposes.
The president of neighbouring Turkey said change was in the air.
Everyone must see and accept this truth. There is now a new reality in Syria, politically and diplomatically.
The United Nations reiterated President Erdogan's point of view.
The need for an orderly political transition has never been more urgent, starting with the urgent formation of inclusive and credible transitional arrangements in Syria.
With the rebels tearing down statues in Damascus's southern suburbs, the Syrian army says it's created an impenetrable military cordon around the capital. Events are moving fast, but momentum is on the insurgent side. For Bashar al-Assad, it looks increasingly likely that his days as president are numbered.
Aaron Zellin researches Sunni Arab jihadi groups in North Africa and Syria at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Welcome, Aaron. Good to see you again. Only a week ago, you were telling me about the fall of Aleppo. How much of Syria is still under the control of President Bashar al-Assad as we speak tonight?
We only see now that 3 provinces of the country are under the control of the regime. It's heartland in the coastal areas around Tartus and Latakia, and then the city center in Damascus. Everything else has fallen either to the HTS-led offensive, the affiliated Southern Ops Room in the south, and then the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army controls north-central Syria, and then the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces control the entire east now.
How do you explain, Aaron, that this rebel advance is progressing so incredibly quickly, especially now they are down into the areas that we were led to believe were Assad's strongholds?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just as surprised as anybody else, and I've literally been following this every single day since the 2011 uprising. But it's clear that it's an illustration that the dire straits of the regime back in 2015 when the Russians first went in was that's been confirmed in many ways, and that if the Russians and the Iranians hadn't gone in then at that time, it's likely the regime would have fallen 9 years ago. But now, because the Russians have been distracted in Ukraine, the Iranians been having to deal with the aftermath of Israel's war on Hamas and Hezbollah, there just isn't anybody there to do it. And because it's been so lightning quick, and HTS has been able to consolidate control and move on to the next cities each time relatively swiftly. It hasn't provided space for a counteroffensive, and instead it's created a momentum of its own where now you're hearing that HTS is facilitating the defection of senior regime officials and officers inside of Damascus City right now.
And so what are Assad's allies that you bring up, Russia and Iran, what are they doing at the president? Are they unwilling to help, or are they just unable to help at this point?
I think that in the beginning they thought maybe they would have more time to create some form of counteroffensive, but because everything has been going so swiftly, you see kind of a fait accompli happening where in the last day or two, you saw Russia calling for civilians from Russian civilians to leave Damascus. You see that their Navy ships have left the ports in the coast so that they wouldn't get hit potentially by the rebel forces. And then Iran and its proxy networks have fled across the border in Iraq as well as Lebanon. And so now it's just the shell of the regime itself. And the question is, how long will this take, and whether it'll be a peaceful takeover of Damascus, or will there be some level of fighting between now and then?
Right, and so just one more in this area without Iran and Russia, as you say. Are Assad's forces then, who are left alone, are they outnumbered? Are they being outmaneuvered? Or are they perhaps unwilling to stand and lose their lives trying to hold on to ground in the name of Assad's regime?
It's definitely all of the above. You see that, it's important to remember that Assad's regime, while he himself is Alawite, they still need Sunnis, but most Sunnis still dislike the regime. So now that it appears that it's all over, they don't want to have anything to do with it anymore. And so the Alawites within the regime have fled mainly to the coastal areas in their heartland in Tartus and Latakia. So it's likely that a lot of the remnants of the regime fighting force are the Sunnis that have been based in Damascus, and they have no interest in probably fighting against HTS at this point, especially since HTS now controls the second, third, and fourth largest cities in the country.
There hasn't been much of a fight put up so far. Are we expecting anything different to happen in Damascus?
Well, when we did talk a week ago, I thought maybe once we got to Hama and Homs, there would be a little bit more of a fight. And, there's been skirmishes here and there, but it hasn't been anything large scale or nearly what we saw maybe a decade ago in the fighting. So at this point, it seems that there probably will be fighting to take the capital, but it likely won't be as big as maybe many would have imagined just a week ago.
We've now had a few days to observe the rebel group around Abu Muhammad al-Jolani from a distance. What do they want?
They want to be the new rulers of Syria. Of course, it'll be in a different manner than what the Assad regime has been doing. Obviously, the Assad regime follows this Ba'athist Arab nationalistic ideology, whereas HTS, their acronym, are conservative Islamists. So they'll try and rule based off of their interpretations of Islam, especially as it relates to minorities within the society. But generally speaking, we have an 8.5-year track record of them governing Idlib in northwest Syria now, and they've primarily just been focused on, giving services and delivering goods as needed to the local population. And it hasn't been anything along the lines of what, say, we've seen with the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, or even, governments like in the Taliban's Afghanistan. It's still a conservative Islamist regime. It still has authoritarian elements, but it's, not quite as, it's not as extreme as the Taliban, Islamic State, or Al-Qaeda.
Will Assad still be president of Syria, do you think, at the end of the year?
No, not at this point. I'd be surprised if he was the president by the end of next week.